I spent over 20 years at the National Transportation Safety Board investigating not only general aviation accidents, but large commercial aircraft accidents all over the world, including having done an ATR 72 that crashed in Roselawn, Indiana back in 1994 due to an icing event as the airplane was going into Chicago on Halloween night back in '94. So I watch ATR accidents and incidents just because I have a lot of familiarity with that type of aircraft. The ATR 72 is really a primary regional airplane. Twin engine turboprop, that means it has two propellers, but it's built for speed. It's got a very narrow wing so that it is a fast turboprop, but the regional carriers like the airplane. Now, in '94, when we had a problem with icing, they moved a lot of those airplanes that were being used here in the United States by American Eagle and some other carriers down south to keep them out of any kind of icing event. They've migrated their way back into the mix because there were fixes made to the aircraft. And so, yes, there have been ATR 72 accidents around the world, but for a variety of different reasons. And this one is curious given the fact that the airplane had been in the air for better than an hour. They were in cruise flight, and all of the sudden they got into some pitch oscillations that resulted in an aero that appears to be an aerodynamic stall and a subsequent what's called or characterized as a flat spin where the airplane is it's not pointed downward, but rather it's flat and it stays in that position all the way, in this case, till ground impact. Aerodynamic stall relates to the wings, not the engine. A lot of people think about an engine stall when you talk about stall. In this case, it's an aerodynamic stall. That is, there's insufficient airflow over the wings to generate enough lift to support the airplane in the air. Weight now becomes a factor and gravity takes over. So the faster the airplane goes, the more lift the wing creates, and that's why airplanes fly. But if it gets too slow, then there isn't enough lift generated by the wings to support the weight. Gravity takes over. The question for investigators, and they're going to break this into pieces, is what was going on with this airplane just prior to the event at 17,000 feet? Did they fly into a weather event that may have had icing? Because icing disrupts the smooth airflow over the top of the wing and in the tail, on the tail section as well. And we've had accidents in the past where too much ice on an airplane has caused them to crash because they lose lift. That'll be one aspect, is looking at the weather. Mechanical operation. Was there a mechanical anomaly or mechanical malfunction or failure that led to a loss of control by the pilots? They couldn't control the pitch attitude because the radar data, at least preliminary, shows that the airplane may have pitched up and down several times. So they're going to be looking at the mechanical soundness or airworthiness of the aircraft. Of course, they'll be looking at the pilots themselves to see how well they were trained. Were they a new crew? Were they a seasoned crew? Did they run into an event that they were trying to handle as a crew? Did they do it properly? So they'll be looking at training and operations. And then, of course, you always got to look at weight and balance, because even though the airplane had been flying for an hour, as you burn off fuel, the weight and balance of the airplane changes. So that can affect the pitch attitude and the pitch control by pilots. So there's a number of different aspects to this accident that investigators will start to delve into. There's two parts to this particular event. An aerodynamic stall is recoverable with sufficient altitude. In this case, they had 17,000 feet, so there was sufficient altitude. There is a prescribed procedure that if the airplane gets into an aerodynamic stall, then there are procedures that the pilots follow. If it starts to spin, you want to neutralize, you want to stop that spin, but you also have to push the nose down further to get the wing to fly. And then you start the recovery by pulling the nose back up to level. So there is a prescribed procedures, and pilots are trained for that procedure in that type of airplane as well as other airplanes. The problem here is that if he got the airplane into a spin for whatever reason, whether it was because of asymmetrical thrust, because again, you got two engines. If you have one engine that has died, now it becomes really a big barn door because it's a lot of drag. And there are prescribed procedures for engine failures. So these things all in combination It's going to be up to the investigators to figure out how this airplane got into. Now, the start of that event would have been a steep spiral, but then it went flat. And flat spins are very, very rare in airplanes. Yes, we have seen them. You see them in some designed airplanes. A couple of general aviation airplanes have flat spin tendencies. It is a rare event for a commercial airliner to get into a flat spin or spiral like this airplane. So investigators are going to be keen on trying to understand how the aircraft entered into that realm of flight, since that airplane has so many protections. It has a stall warning system. It has a stick pusher system that if you do get the nose up too high and you start to enter into a stall, it'll force the nose over to protect the airplane from actually stalling. So all of these things are going to have to be looked at, especially with investigators looking at the mechanical soundness or airworthiness of the airplane. It's you push the nose down to get the wing flying again because you have to get the airflow back over the wings. If the airplane stalls and the nose just falls through and you pull to get the nose back up, you don't have enough forward or horizontal speed or energy to now create enough lift over the wing. So you push the nose down, it basically is a big glider, if you will, even with power. But you push the nose down to get the airflow back over the wing. Once that airflow establishes over the wing, it creates lift. That's the moment that you start the recovery and bring the airplane back to a level attitude. One of the primary elements of a stall spin, the spin part of it, is you have to have yaw. Now, if you think about the airplane, it has three different axes: pitch, up and down, roll, right and left, and yaw, where the yaw is kind of like fishtailing in your car. So while the car is, still going basically straight down the road, but the tail or the trunk of the car wants to swap ends with you, that's yaw. And in an airplane, all three of these aerodynamic principles are critical because you always want to be in what is characterized as coordinated flight. But if during the stall, the tail starts to slide out or slide in, or you induce a roll and a yaw, now the airplane can go over the top or enter into this spin, which is a steep nose down attitude, which we typically are more characteristic seeing when, all this airplane is diving to the ground and it's spinning. But in this case, the nose has fallen through, but all of a sudden the nose or the aircraft fuselage has gone level. And again, now it's all horizontal speed is gone. It's now just vertical. And you have zero airflow over the wings, even in the spiral, because there is insufficient lift being generated. So now the aircraft just stays in that flat attitude. Gravity is taken over. The weight of the aircraft is falling straight down with this spiral moment. It's almost impossible to recover from a flat spin. There are techniques that are tried. You can actually try to bring the power up to full power and then bring it back. Similar to the rocking motion that when you get stuck in the snow and you're trying to get out of a snowbank and you gun the engine to go forward and then you relax and it goes back and you get the car rocking. You're trying to do that with the airplane, except you're trying to change the pitch attitude using increased thrust to pitch the nose up, decreased thrust to pitch the nose down. And if you remember United 232 going into Sioux City, they were using differential thrust to turn the airplane, using power to cause the airplane to pitch up or reducing the power. So there are techniques, but we don't typically train pilots to do that because we never expect the aircraft or the crew to ever be in that position. Well, it'll be handled by the Brazilian authorities because it is a French-made airplane. They will invite the French as technical advisors. They will also probably invite the United States, one, because we have a lot of resources from an accident investigation standpoint. Plus, we do operate ATRs here in this country. So we're going to want to know if there's an airworthiness issue that's going on with the airplane that we need to filter back to our carriers so that we don't have a repeat of this type of event. So those folks, and then of course others, the engine manufacturer, the propeller manufacturer, all of those particular manufacturer representatives will assist as technical advisors to the Brazilians. The other thing that's going to be critical is finding the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. Now, a lot of people always go, yeah, once they find the black boxes, we're in good shape. Not necessarily, because yes, those are the key tools that investigators will use to get a lot of information. But unfortunately, in the past, if those cockpit voice recorder or flight data recorders have not been properly maintained, we lose data. If they lost power to those boxes in the flight during the flight, we lose data. If they are damaged substantially from the impact and the post-crash fire, we lose data. So it's key for investigators to, yes, find those boxes, but it's also key for investigators to gather as many parts of the aircraft as possible, because you need that physical evidence to try and corroborate certain data that you do obtain in the event that you don't have the recorded electronic data. And the cockpit voice recorder is actually going to tell you, hey, what was going on with the crew? What were they talking about? What were they trying to handle? What transpired? Was it a benign event that escalated into an emergency? Was it an unexpected event? Could it have been some sort of explosive device? Could it have been a catastrophic mechanical failure that surprised the crew and they had no ability? Those kinds of things are going to have to be ferreted out, hopefully from the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. Right now, no, it's just so early. There's not enough information. And I know that everybody, we live in a society of quick answers and that kind of stuff. But the process of accident investigation centers around being thorough and methodical. You have to collect all the facts, conditions, and circumstances. And while things somewhat look obvious in some regards, you can't hang your hat on it. We know that the airplane was out of control. We know the crew wasn't able to control it. Those are the obvious things. The question is why. And the simple principle of accident investigation is you got to ask why questions until you run out of why questions, because that takes you back to origins. That takes you back to not necessarily the root cause, but at least a good area to explore for root cause or contributing factors. The cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder are typically the first couple of items that are looked for by investigators and first responders. And I wouldn't be surprised if those two boxes haven't already been found and finding their way to the proper authority that's going to read those boxes out. I think when you look at the global airline business, whether it's the legacy carriers, the big carriers, or a regional type carrier like this one, you have to remember that the certifying authority, the FAA, if you will, of Brazil or some other country, they are in the business of providing the safest mode of transportation. They can't afford to have accidents like this, or nobody will ever fly on an airline. So they do their best, just like we do here in the United States, to not only collaborate with the United States, the FAA, and the French authorities, and other certifying authorities around the world, but it is really in their best interest. Why? Because if you book a ticket to Brazil and then you want to go to a smaller city, you're going to have to get on these regional carriers. And like here in the United States, where you book an airline or book a ticket on one of the legacy carriers, and then all of a sudden you're on a regional jet that has that carrier's name on it, but it's not really operated by that particular carrier. It's operated by a smaller carrier. The fact is that they have to have an equivalent level of safety. And that's imperative around the world because we are flying international passengers. So when you look at the total safety system, it's second to none. I mean, there are so many safeguards in place. And that's why thorough and methodical accident investigation in this particular instance is going to be critical. Why? If there's a problem, we need to fix it. If it's a problem with a carrier or pilots that handle locally in Brazil, that's one thing. But if there's a mechanical problem or some sort of anomaly with that aircraft that could affect the fleet, then the world fleet needs to know about it, including here in the United States. So it's very imperative that yes, the investigative process starts now, but it's thorough and methodical. I think right now, the next 24 to 48 hours, I think more information is going to come out. Now, people here, at least in the United States, have to understand that the rest of the world does not investigate accidents like we do here. We don't release, I mean, here in the United States, we release information on a very regular basis as the process goes on. That's not necessarily true in other countries. And so there may be dead spots or voids of information, people wanting to know what's going on. The expectation is the information will filter out, but you got to take it with a grain of salt because unless it comes from an official authority, there's going to be a lot of internet speculation, and the facts will speak for themselves. The interpretation of the facts, that's another thing.